Lesson 34.3 is going to talk about the cosine function. So we're going to find our key parts, period, midline, and amplitude of the cosine function, and then graph it. So make sure you have the note sheet that goes along with this, something to write with, and either a calculator or Desmos to help you out. Okay, so you can see the cosine function is really similar to the sine function. It's going to still repeat every 2 pi or 360 degrees. Okay, now when we start changing our amplitude, that will change how high up and down the function goes. Okay, and when we change the number in front of the x, our b value, that will change our period. So the rules for this are the same thing as sine. That's why I just put this math tip again, so you can look at it. Okay, the only thing that's different between sine and cosine, the big main difference is your starting point and your ending point. Let me kind of draw a box around one cycle here. Now on the sine function, remember we started and ended on the x-axis. We started at 0, 0, and wherever our period ended up was also on the x-axis. Okay, whereas the cosine is going to be different. You're actually going to start on your amplitude and end on your amplitude. Halfway between would be where you have your bottom point, okay, your lower point of your amplitude, and then your x-intercepts are actually the midway points between those. Okay, so we're still going to do our 5-point method. It will just be a little different with the starting point. Now remember, the amplitude, when we change the number in front, it's going to stretch the graph. So the bigger the number in front, the more stretched vertically it is. The smaller the number in front, the more it shrinks. Okay? And when we change the period, we change how often that function will repeat. Okay? So it will just change how long or short our cycle is. So let's just go over a couple of these again, practicing finding your amplitude and period. So starting with number 1, remember the period is always the number in front. Oh, sorry, our amplitude. Got ahead of myself. Our amplitude is always our coefficient in front. So in this one, our amplitude is 5. Okay, our period would be always 2 pi over b. Now again, the b is the coefficient in front of x. So in this one, okay, it's just 2 pi. Since it's 2 pi over 1, we really wouldn't have to divide anything out. Sorry about that. Here's that answer, and here's that answer. Okay. For number 2, again, our amplitude is our coefficient in front, so that's 3. No work for that. Our period, we'd have to take 2 pi and divide it by 1/2. Now, we know we don't divide fractions. We always multiply by their reciprocals. That'd be 2 pi times 2 over 1. So our period ends up being 4 pi. So that one will take a little longer to repeat. It's a little more stretched out. Okay. Now the next one, even though it has a negative in front, doesn't change what we do. It just changes our starting point. We would start at -1/3. Period would be 2 pi over our b value, so over 4, which would reduce then to pi over 2. It's nothing too crazy. Okay, so I'm going to have you guys try try one. I'm going to have you guys find your amplitude and period for this one. So let's start with the amplitude. What is the amplitude for 7 cosine of 1/4 x? Amplitude you should have got as your coefficient in front, 7. Okay, next we'll find the period. If we have 1/4 x, what's the period of this trig function? Okay, well, you'd have to take 2 pi and divide it by 1/4, which ends up being 2 pi times 4 over 1. So you should have got 8 pi for your period. Okay, so there you go. So it's the same exact steps as the sine function. Okay, what's going to be different is when we actually graph them. So again, we're still doing our same steps, our 5-point method, but in this part, the cosine graph starts at the amplitude on the y-axis. So we still discover what our amplitude is and our period. We always need that first. Okay, but our first point is always going to be at the top part. Okay, so we always start and end at our amplitude. Our halfway point between there would be at our lower amplitude, so at the negative value. And then halfway between those points is where you're going to put your x-intercepts. So we still have 5 points. We're just changing up the order in which we plot them now. Okay, so let's look at this first graph, number 1. I have an amplitude of 2. My period would be 2 pi over 1, so that's just 2 pi. So let's plot some points here. We are starting at 2, or start at our amplitude. And if I call this 2 pi down here, our full cycle, we would end at our amplitude. And now it's all those halfway points. So halfway between there would be 1 pi. So there's your lower amplitude at -2. Halfway between there is your x-intercepts. So this would be at 1/2 pi. This would be at 3/4 pi. Okay, so you can see this curve has a little bit more of a U shape, not so much as like a roller coaster shape, a curvy shape, but it's the same idea. So you start and end at your amplitude. Midpoint between there is your lower amplitude. Midpoint between those is your x-intercepts. So let's try another one. We have cosine of 1/2 x. So I don't see anything in front, so that means my amplitude is just at 1. Okay, 2 pi over a half. 2 pi over b for our period. So that will end up being 2 pi times 2 over 1. So that makes our period 4 pi. So we're going to start and end at 4 pi. So there's your amplitude. Remember, our amplitude is 1, so I'm just going to go up 1 for my amplitude. So we start and end at our amplitude. Halfway between there would be 2 pi, and that would be your lower amplitude, so at -1. And our halfway points between those are where our x-intercepts would go. So halfway, halfway. And draw on a nice smooth curve, and you are done. Okay. Let me do one more for you guys. As you can see, I already graphed number 4, so you guys can try that one and see if you get what I got. But I'm going to do one more with you, and that is number 3. So my amplitude here is -3. Now my period, if I did 2 pi over 1/3, it becomes times 3 over 1. So that's how I got 6 pi. Okay, so we start and end at our period, so we're going to start and end at 6 pi. So we start at our amplitude. Now our amplitude here is negative. So I'm going to start at -3 and end at -3. Our halfway point, which should be at 3 pi, halfway between 0 and 6 pi, that would be our other amplitude. So we're going to go up to +3 on this one. And then halfway between there is where we have our x-intercept. So halfway, halfway. So here's one x-intercept. Here's my other one. Okay, and then we connect it with a nice smooth curve. Okay, so you can see when we have a negative in front how that flips the graph. That's just a transformation. Okay, but it doesn't change your steps. You always start and end at your amplitude. Find your halfway point for your other side of your amplitude. Halfway between there is your x-intercepts. Okay, so one last problem for you guys to try. I'm going to have you do this one. It's -4 cosine of 2x. So let's start first. Find your amplitude and find the period. Okay, amplitude here is -4. Period was pi. Okay, 2 pi over 2 would reduce it to 1 pi. So now go ahead and graph using your 5 points. Okay. If you graphed it correctly, it should look like this. So I started and ended at -4. Halfway between there at pi over 2, I have it up at +4. And then halfway between those 2 points, I have it at my x-intercepts. Okay. So again, still same 5-point method. You're just changing your starting points. That's how sine and cosine differ a little bit.